June 20, 2024, the day Venezuela crossed the Rubicon. Let me tell you about the moment I realized we were standing at the edge of something far bigger than a border dispute. It was June 20th, when Venezuela's National Assembly, in a move that barely registered on Western news cycles, unanimously approved a new law annexing two-thirds of Guyana's Essequibo region, a territory larger than England, rich in oil, gold, and geopolitical dynamite. The official statement from Caracas was clinical: almost the Essequibo is Venezuelan by historical right, and this law merely formalizes what has always been ours. But here's the thing: this wasn't just another Latin American territorial spat. This was a line Venezuela shouldn't have crossed, not because of some abstract principle of international law, but because it forced the United States, China, and Russia into a high-stakes game of chicken where the rules have changed, and the old guardrails are gone. I've spent 3 decades studying how great powers respond when smaller states test their red lines. I've seen this movie before, in Crimea, in the South China Sea, in the Falklands. And what I can tell you is when a country like Venezuela, backed by external patrons, makes a move this audacious, the response isn't just about the territory in question. It's about signaling to the rest of the world what happens when you challenge the post-Cold War order. The problem? That order is already crumbling, and the signals being sent are getting lost in the noise. So let's start with what you've probably heard, the official narrative. Then, I'll show you why it's dangerously incomplete. The story they want you to believe. On the surface, this looks like a straightforward case of Venezuelan nationalism run amok. The Essequibo dispute dates back to the 19th century, when an 1899 arbitration award granted the territory to British Guiana. Venezuela has long claimed the ruling was rigged, but for decades, the issue lay dormant. Then, in 2015, ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore oil reserves in the disputed waters. Suddenly, the Essequibo wasn't just a historical footnote, it was a prize worth fighting for. Fast forward to 2023. Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro, facing collapsing approval ratings and an economy in freefall, holds a referendum asking voters if they support creating a new Venezuelan state in the Essequibo. The result? A suspiciously unanimous 95% in favor. International observers called it a sham, but Maduro pressed ahead, declaring the region part of Venezuela and ordering state oil companies to begin licensing blocks in the disputed waters. Guyana, understandably alarmed, took the case to the International Court of Justice, which ruled in April 2024 that Venezuela must refrain from any actions that would alter the status quo. That's where the official narrative ends. The U.S. State Department condemned Venezuela's provocative and unlawful actions, the OAS called for restraint, and the Western media framed this as another example of Maduro's authoritarianism threatening a small, democratic neighbor. The data seems to support Venezuela's military is a shadow of its former self, its economy is in tatters, and its only real allies are Russia, China, and Iran, hardly a coalition that strikes fear into the hearts of Washington's foreign policy establishment. But here's the problem with this: it assumes that Venezuela is acting alone. It assumes that Maduro is just another tin-pot dictator throwing a tantrum. And it assumes that the U.S. response will be measured, proportional, and confined to diplomatic channels. All 3 assumptions are wrong. What they're not telling you. Let's start with the first lie of Venezuela isn't acting alone. In the weeks leading up to the June 20th annexation law, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov made an unannounced visit to Caracas. The official readout was vague, strengthening bilateral ties, but sources in the Russian Foreign Ministry later confirmed that the trip was about coordinating positions on the Essequibo. Then, just days after the law passed, China's special envoy for Latin America arrived in Georgetown, Guyana's capital, with a "China supports Guyana's sovereignty, but we urge restraint on all sides." Now, why would Russia and China be so interested in a territorial dispute in South America? The answer lies in what the Essequibo, a test case for the new multipolar order. For Russia, Venezuela is a low-cost way to bleed U.S. attention and resources. Moscow doesn't need Caracas to win, it just needs the U.S. to get bogged down in another crisis, preferably one that distracts from Ukraine. The Wagner Group, now rebranded as the Africa Corps, has already been spotted in Venezuela, training local militias. And let's not forget that Russia's state-owned oil company, Rosneft, has been quietly exiting its operations in Venezuelan waters that now include the Essequibo. For China, the calculus is different. Beijing doesn't want a war in its backyard, but it does want to demonstrate that the US can't unilaterally enforce its version of international law. China's interest in the Essequibo is Exxon's offshore blocks are part of a larger US-led energy play in the Caribbean, and Beijing would love nothing more than to see American commies forced out. More importantly, if Venezuela gets away with annexing the Essequibo, it sets a precedent for China's own territorial ambitions: Taiwan, the South China Sea, the Senkaku Islands. If the US blinks here, why wouldn't it blink there? Then there's the US angle. The Biden administration has been remarkably quiet about the Essequibo, at least in public. But because the White House is paralyzed. On one side, you have the hawks, led by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who see this as an opportunity to reassert US dominance in Latin America. On the other, you have the realists, like Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who know that any military intervention would be a disaster. The result? A policy of strategic vague threats, half-hearted sanctions, and a whole lot of hoping that Venezuela backs down. But Venezuela isn't backing down. And that's because Maduro isn't the only one calling the shots. The geopolitical chessboard. Let's out for a moment. What we're witnessing in the Essequibo isn't just a territorial dispute, it's a microcosm of the broader struggle between unipolarity and multipolarity. For the past 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption that it can enforce its vision of a rules-based international order. That order is now under attack, not just from revisionist powers like Russia and China, but from the very states the US claims to protect. Realist theory tells us that great powers don't tolerate rivals in their spheres of influence. The Monroe Doctrine was never just about keeping European powers out of the Americas, it was about ensuring that the US could dictate the terms of engagement in its own backyard. But here's the US no longer has the economic or military bandwidth to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. And its adversaries know it. Russia and China have spent the last decade systematically eroding US influence in Latin America. Russia has military bases in Nicaragua and Venezuela. China has become the largest trading partner for most of South America. And both countries have been happy to prop up anti-American regimes, from Cuba to Bolivia to, yes, Venezuela. The Essequibo crisis is the first real test of whether the US still has the will to push back. Historical parallels are instructive here. In 1962, the US went to the brink of nuclear war to prevent the Soviet Union from placing missiles in Cuba. Why? Because Cuba was in America's backyard, and the Soviets crossing that line was an existential threat. Today, the roles are reversed. Venezuela is Russia's Cuba, a client state that allows Moscow to project power into the Western Hemisphere. The difference? In 1962, the US had the economic and military dominance to enforce its red lines. Today, it doesn't. That's why this crisis is so dangerous. The US is being forced to choose between too bad: intervene militarily and risk a wider war, or do nothing and signal to the rest of the world that its red lines are negotiable. Neither option is good. But the worst option of all is pretending that this is just another regional dispute, that Venezuela is acting alone, that Russia and China aren't involved, and that the US can afford to look the other way. The military: why this could spiral out of control. Now, let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get really ugly. Venezuela's armed forces are a shell of what they were in the 1980s, but they're not irrelevant. The country has around 120,000 active duty troops, a mix of Russian and Chinese equipment, and a growing paramilitary force trained by Wagner. More importantly, Venezuela has been preparing for a conflict in the Essequibo for years. Satellite imagery shows new military bases along the border, upgraded air defenses, and even the deployment of short-range ballistic missiles. Guyana, by contrast, has a tiny military, around 3,000 active personnel, and no real air force or navy. Its only real defense is the US security guarantee. But here's the US has no permanent military presence in Guyana. The closest major US base is in Puerto Rico, over 1,000 miles away. That means any US response would have to be rapid and decisive, or it would be too late. The Pentagon's war games suggest that a Venezuelan invasion of the Essequibo could be over in 72 hours. The US could respond with airstrikes, but Venezuela's Russian-made S-300 air defense systems would make that risky. The US could send in special forces, but that would risk a direct confrontation with Russian or Iranian advisors on the ground. And any full-scale invasion would require a massive logistical effort, one that the US military, already stretched thin by Ukraine and Taiwan, might not be able to sustain. Then there's the nuclear wildcard. Russia has repeatedly warned that any US military intervention in Venezuela would trigger a proportional response. That could mean anything from cyber attacks to the deployment of Russian nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela. It's a bluff, but it's a bluff the US can't afford to call. The hawks in Washington will tell you that this is a winnable fight, that the US can teach Venezuela a lesson without escalating into a wider war. They're wrong. Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya should have taught us that military interventions in the global south never go according to plan. But the foreign policy establishment has a short memory, and the temptation to do something is always strong. The domestic why Biden can't afford to back down. Here's where things get even messier. The Essequibo crisis isn't just a foreign policy problem, it's a domestic political one. And in an election year, that changes everything. Joe Biden is in a bind. His approval ratings are underwater, inflation is still a problem, and the Democratic base is divided. The last thing he needs is another foreign policy crisis, especially one that plays into Republican narratives about weakness. But here's the if Biden does nothing, he'll be accused of abandoning an ally. If he intervenes, he'll be accused of starting another war. The Republicans, led by figures like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham, are already framing this as a test of American resolve. Rubio has called for crippling sanctions on Venezuela, while Graham has suggested that the U.S. should make it clear that any attack on Guyana will be met with overwhelming force. The messaging is if Biden doesn't act, he's weak. If he does act, he's a warmonger. But the real pressure is coming from Florida, a must-win state for Biden in November. Florida's Venezuelan exile community, which leans heavily Republican, is demanding action. Meanwhile, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is pushing back, arguing that any military intervention would be a disaster. The result? A White House that's paralyzed, issuing vague statements about supporting Guyana's sovereignty while doing nothing concrete. This is the problem with American foreign policy, it's driven more by domestic politics than by strategic necessity. The U.S. doesn't have a grand strategy for Latin America because it doesn't need one until it does. And when a crisis like the Essequibo erupts, the response is reactive, short-term, and often counterproductive. 3. How this could play out. So where do we go from here? Let's look at the 3 most likely scenarios, ranked by probability. Scenario 1, the frozen conflict. In this scenario, Venezuela consolidates its control over the Essequibo without a full-scale invasion. Maduro declares victory, the U.S. imposes more sanctions, and the ICJ rules against Venezuela, but no one enforces the ruling. The status quo becomes the new Venezuela controls the territory in practice, but Guyana retains international recognition. This is the most likely outcome because it's the path of least resistance. The U.S. avoids a war, Venezuela gets a propaganda win, and Russia and China avoid a direct confrontation with Washington. The problem? Frozen conflicts have a way of thawing. In 5 years, when Venezuela's economy is even worse and Maduro is even more desperate, he might decide to push further. Or Guyana, backed by Exxon and the U.S., might decide to retake the territory by force. Either way, the risk of escalation never really goes away. Scenario 2, the proxy war. In this scenario, the U.S. and its allies arm Guyana to the teeth, turning the Essequibo into a battleground for a low-intensity proxy war. The U.S. provides intelligence, weapons, and training, while Venezuela relies on Russian and Iranian support. The fighting is limited but bloody, with both sides using drones, special forces, and cyber attacks to gain the upper hand. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. Proxy wars have a way of spiraling out of control. One miscalculation, a U.S. drone strike that kills Russian advisors, a Venezuelan missile that hits a Guyanese oil rig, and suddenly, you're in a direct confrontation with Moscow. And unlike Ukraine, where the U.S. can arm Kiev without putting boots on the ground, a proxy war in the Essequibo would require a much larger U.S. commitment. Scenario 3, the full-scale war. This is the nightmare. Venezuela launches a full-scale invasion of the Essequibo, the US responds with airstrikes, and Russia deploys volunteers to Venezuela. The fighting spreads to Colombia, Brazil, and even the Caribbean. Oil prices skyrocket, global markets icy, and the US finds itself in a two-front war: Ukraine in the east, Venezuela in the south. This scenario is unlikely, but not impossible. If Maduro feels cornered, if his regime is on the brink of collapse, if the US imposes a naval blockade, if the opposition makes a serious push for power, he might decide that his only way out is to go all in on the Essequibo. And if that happens, the US will have no choice but to respond. The grand strategy: why the US keeps losing. Let's take a step back and ask the bigger why is the US in this mess in the first place? The answer, I think, lies in the failure of American grand strategy over the past 3 decades. Since the end of the Cold War, the US has operated under the assumption that it can reshape the world in its own image. We invaded Iraq to spread democracy. We bombed Libya to protect human rights. We extended NATO to the borders of Russia to secure the peace. And what did we get in return? A world that's more unstable, more dangerous, and more hostile to American interests than at any point since the 1930s. The problem isn't that the US is too weak, it's that it's trying to do too much. The doctrine of liberal hegemony assumes that the US can and should be the world's policeman, intervening wherever and whenever it sees fit. But the world has changed. The US no longer has the economic dominance it once did. Its military is overstretched. And its adversaries Russia, China, Iran have learned how to exploit its weaknesses. The Essequibo crisis is a perfect example of this. The US spent the last 20 years focused on the Middle East and Asia, assuming that Latin America would take care of itself. Meanwhile, Russia and China moved in, filling the vacuum left by American neglect. And now, when the US finally wakes up to the threat, it finds itself in a position where any response is fraught with risk. This is the pattern of American decline. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow erosion of influence, as the US finds itself bogged down in crises it didn't anticipate and can't control. The British Empire didn't fall in a day, it was a series of small defeats, each one seemingly insignificant, until one day, the empire was gone. The US is on the same path. What should be done instead? So what's the alternative? How does the US navigate this crisis without making things worse? Here's what I would recommend, controversial as it may be. First, the US needs to accept that it can't enforce its will everywhere. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. The US no longer has the capacity to dictate terms to Latin America, and pretending otherwise will only lead to more disasters like the Essequibo. Instead, the US should adopt a policy of offshore balancing, supporting allies when necessary, but avoiding direct intervention unless absolutely vital to American security. Second, the US should use economic leverage, not military force. Venezuela's economy is on life support. The US should tighten sanctions on Maduro's inner circle, target Russian and Chinese entities propping up his regime, and work with European allies to cut off Venezuela's access to the global financial system. The goal isn't to strangle the Venezuelan people, it's to make it impossible for Maduro to fund his military adventures. The US has done this before, and it works. Look at how sanctions on Iran's oil sector crippled its economy in the 2010s, forcing Tehran to the negotiating table. The same logic applies here. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's military isn't the monolithic force it once was. The Bolivarian National Armed Forces are a shadow of their former selves. Decades of corruption, brain drain, and US sanctions have hollowed them out. The Navy, for instance, has lost nearly 60% of its operational capacity since 2010, according to a 2023 report by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. The Air Force is in even worse shape, most of its Russian-made Sukhoi jets are grounded due to lack of spare parts. The Army, while still the largest branch, is plagued by desertions and low morale. Maduro knows this, which is why he's relying so heavily on Russian Wagner Group mercenaries and Iranian-backed militias to prop up his regime. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's military threat to Guyana isn't about capability, it's about signaling. Maduro isn't stupid. He knows his forces couldn't sustain a prolonged conflict with Guyana, let alone a US-backed one. What he's doing is testing the waters, probing for weaknesses in the US and regional response. This is classic hybrid warfare, the same playbook Russia used in Crimea in 2014. Create a crisis, gauge the reaction, and then escalate or de-escalate based on the response. The problem for Maduro is that he's miscalculated. The US isn't the distracted, war-weary superpower it was in 2014. The Biden administration has made it clear that it sees Latin America as a critical theater in the great power competition with China and Russia. And that changes everything. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate crisis. The Essequibo dispute isn't just about a piece of land, it's about the future of US influence in the Western Hemisphere. If Maduro gets away with this, it sends a message to every autocrat in that the US won't respond. That's why the US Southern Command has been quietly ramping up its presence in the Caribbean. In October 2023, the USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group conducted joint exercises with the Brazilian and Colombian navies in the Atlantic. In November, the U.S. Air Force deployed B-52 bombers to Puerto Rico for the first time in over a decade. These aren't routine operations, they're signals. The U.S. is drawing a line in the sand, and Maduro is about to find out what happens when you cross it. But here's where things get complicated. The U.S. can't afford to go it alone. The days of unilateral intervention are over. If the U.S. wants to counter Venezuela effectively, it needs to work with regional partners. Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico are the key players here. Brazil, in particular, is the linchpin. As the largest country in South America, it has the military and economic weight to shape the outcome of this crisis. The problem is that Brazil's President Lula da Silva has been playing both sides. On one hand, he's condemned Maduro's aggression. On the other, he's refused to join U.S. sanctions, fearing they'll destabilize the region. This ambivalence is dangerous. If Brazil doesn't take a firm stand, Maduro will interpret it as weakness, and that's when things could spiral out of control. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the China. Beijing has been quietly extending its influence in Latin America for years, and Venezuela is its crown jewel. China has poured over $60 billion into Venezuela since 2007, mostly in the form of loans secured by oil. It's also the largest buyer of Venezuelan crude, accounting for nearly 40% of its exports. But here's the China doesn't want a war in its backyard. A conflict in the Essequibo would disrupt oil supplies, destabilize the region, and force Beijing to choose between its economic interests and its alliance with Maduro. That's a choice China doesn't want to make. The US should exploit this. Washington should make it clear to Beijing that if it doesn't rein in Maduro, the US will impose secondary sanctions on Chinese firms doing business with Venezuela. That's a red line China can't afford to cross. Russia, on the other hand, is a different story. Putin sees Venezuela as a way to bleed the US in its own hemisphere. The Wagner Group's presence in Venezuela is no accident, it's part of a broader strategy to create a network of Russian proxies in Latin America. The US needs to counter this by supporting democratic forces in the region, not just with words, but with action. The 2019 Lima Group, which coordinated international pressure on Maduro, was a good start. But it's not enough. The US should revive the idea of a regional defense pact, something akin to NATO for the Americas. It's a long shot, but it's the only way to counter the growing influence of Russia and China in the region. Finally, there's the question of what happens if Maduro doesn't back down. The US has a few options, none of them good. The first is a naval blockade, which would strangle Venezuela's economy but risk escalating into a direct conflict. The second is a targeted military strike, perhaps against Venezuela's oil infrastructure, to cripple its ability to fund its military. The third is a covert operation to support opposition forces inside Venezuela, though that carries the risk of blowback. None of these options are ideal, but the US can't afford to do nothing. The longer this crisis drags on, the more emboldened Maduro becomes, and the harder it will be to contain. The Essequibo dispute is a wake-up call. The US can no longer afford to treat Latin America as an afterthought. The region is on the front lines of the new Cold War, and the stakes couldn't be higher. If the US wants to maintain its influence in the Western Hemisphere, it needs to act decisively, but smartly. That means using economic leverage, building regional alliances, and avoiding the kind of overreach that has defined US foreign policy for the past 2 decades. The alternative is a slow, painful decline, one crisis at a time. And that's a future none of us can afford. Now, what most people don't realize is that Maduro's gamble in Essequibo isn't just about oil or territorial action, it's a desperate survival tactic for a regime that's running out of options at home. The domestic political dimensions of this crisis are just as critical as the geopolitical ones, if not more so. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela's economy is a shell of what it once was. By 2023, GDP had contracted by nearly 80% since 2013, according to the IMF. Hyperinflation, which peaked at over 1,000,000% in 2018, has stabilized only because the bolivar has effectively been replaced by the US dollar in daily transactions. But dollarization isn't a sign of economic health, it's a sign of complete collapse. The Venezuelan state can no longer print money to pay its bills, so it's had to rely on a patchwork of informal dollarization, remittances from the diaspora, and, most importantly, illicit gold and oil exports. The Essequibo dispute is, in part, an attempt to distract from this economic reality while also creating a new revenue stream. If Venezuela can secure control of the offshore oil fields in the disputed zone, fields that ExxonMobil and other comies have already begun developing, it could theoretically generate tens of billions in new income. But here's the uncomfortable: even if Maduro wins this fight, it won't save his regime. The structural problems are too deep. The opposition, for its part, is in shambles. The 2024 presidential election, which Maduro is almost certain to steal, is a case study in how not to challenge an autocrat. The main opposition coalition, the Unitary Platform, has been fractured by infighting, with key figures like Maria Corina Machado, who won the opposition primary in October 2023 with over 90% of the vote, barred from running by the regime. The US and its allies have tried to pressure Maduro into holding free elections, but the reality is that the opposition has no unified strategy. Some factions, like those led by Enrique Capriles, still believe in negotiating with the regime. Others, like Machado's supporters, want to boycott the election entirely. Meanwhile, the average Venezuelan is too busy trying to survive to care about political infighting. Polls show that while 80% of Venezuelans disapprove of Maduro, only about 30% are actively engaged in opposition politics. The rest are either apathetic or too afraid to speak out. This is where the US and its allies have made a critical mistake. For years, Washington has treated Venezuela as a problem to be solved through sanctions and diplomatic pressure, rather than a complex political ecosystem that requires a long-term strategy. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, which included crippling oil sanctions and the recognition of Juan Guaidó as interim president, was well-intentioned but ultimately counterproductive. It didn't topple Maduro, but it did accelerate the collapse of Venezuela's economy, pushing millions more into poverty and exile. The Biden administration has tried to walk back some of these policies, offering sanctions relief in exchange for electoral concessions, but the damage has already been done. The regime has learned to adapt, diversifying its revenue streams through gold mining, cryptocurrency, and alliances with Russia and Iran. Now, with the Essequibo crisis, we're seeing the next phase of Maduro's survival nationalism. The regime has spent years stoking anti-imperialist sentiment, blaming Venezuela's problems on US sanctions and foreign interference. The Essequibo dispute is the perfect issue to rally the population around. It's a territorial grievance that dates back to the 19th century, and it's easy to frame as a David versus Goliath struggle against Guyana and its Western backers. The regime has already held a referendum widely seen as fraudulent, where over 95% of voters supposedly approved the creation of a new Venezuelan state in Essequibo. The fact that turnout was likely low and the results were almost certainly fabricated doesn't matter. What matters is that Maduro now has a narrative to sell to his base. But here's the thing about nationalists: they're a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they can unite a population behind a leader, at least temporarily. On the other hand, they raise expectations that the regime can't possibly meet. If Maduro invades Essequibo and fails to secure the territory, he'll look weak. If he invades and succeeds, he'll face international condemnation and even harsher sanctions. And if he does nothing, he'll look like a paper tiger. The most likely scenario is that he'll engage in a low-level conflict, perhaps sending troops to occupy a few border towns or harassing Guyanese oil ships, while avoiding a full-scale war. This would allow him to claim victory without risking too much. but even that carries risks. The Venezuelan military, which has been hollowed out by corruption and desertions, is in no shape to fight a prolonged conflict. And if the US or Brazil were to intervene, Maduro's bluff would be called immediately. The real danger, though, is that this crisis could spiral out of control in ways no one anticipates. Let's say Maduro does order a limited incursion into Essequibo. Guyana, which has no real military to speak of, would almost certainly request US or Brazilian assistance. The US has already conducted joint military exercises with Guyana, and Brazil has been quietly building up its presence in the region, particularly in the state of Roraima, which borders both Venezuela and Guyana. If either country were to send troops, it would mark the first direct military confrontation between Venezuela and a major power in decades. And once that happens, all bets are off. Maduro could escalate, perhaps by targeting US or Brazilian assets in the region. Or he could back down, which would be a humiliating defeat for a regime that has staked its legitimacy on this issue. The other wild card is the Venezuelan people. For years, the regime has relied on repression and co-optation to stay in power. But repression has its limits. The protests of 2017, which saw millions take to the streets, were crushed with brutal force, but they also showed that the population is not entirely cowed. If Maduro's Essequibo gambit fails, or if the economy collapses further, we could see a new wave of unrest. The problem is that the opposition is too divided to capitalize on it. The most likely outcome is that the regime will survive, but at the cost of further isolating Venezuela from the international community. The country is already a pariah state, but if Maduro doubles down on Essequibo, it could become a full-blown rogue state, cut off from global markets and dependent on Russia, China, and Iran for survival. So where does this leave us? The US and its allies need to recognize that Venezuela is no longer just a humanitarian crisis, it's a geopolitical flashpoint. The Essequibo dispute is a symptom of a larger regime that is willing to take reckless risks to stay in power. The only way to counter this is with a long-term strategy that combines economic pressure, diplomatic engagement, and support for democratic forces inside Venezuela. But here's the hard: there are no quick fixes. The US needs to stop treating Venezuela as a problem to be solved in a single election cycle. It needs to work with regional partners to contain Maduro's ambitions while also preparing for the day when his regime finally collapses. Because collapse is coming. It may not be tomorrow, or next year, but it's coming. And when it does, the US and its allies need to be ready. That means having a plan for post-Maduro Venezuela, one that doesn't repeat the mistakes of the past. It means working with the opposition to build a credible alternative, not just propping up figures like Guaidó who have no real support on the ground. It means engaging with Venezuela's neighbors, particularly Brazil and Colombia, to ensure that the transition is as smooth as possible. And it means recognizing that Venezuela's crisis is not just a Venezuelan problem, it's a regional problem, one that could destabilize the entire hemisphere if it's not managed properly. The Essequibo dispute is a wake-up call. But it's also an opportunity. If the US and its allies play their cards right, they can use this crisis to rebuild their influence in Latin America and counter the growing presence of Russia and China. If they don't, they'll be left watching as Venezuela spirals further into chaos and as the region slips further into the orbit of America's adversaries. The choice is theirs. But time is running out. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the future of US influence in Latin America. The Essequibo gambit wasn't some spontaneous act of desperation, it was a calculated move to test Washington's resolve. And if we're being honest, the response so far has been underwhelming. The Biden administration's sanctions on Venezuela's gold exports and the State Department's carefully worded condemnations are the diplomatic equivalent of a sternly worded letter. Maduro isn't trembling. Neither are Putin or Xi, who are watching this unfold like vultures circling a wounded animal. Let me explain why this matters. The US has spent the last 2 decades treating Latin America as an afterthought, oscillating between neglect and heavy-handed intervention. The Monroe Doctrine is dead in practice, but no one in Washington has bothered to draft a replacement. Meanwhile, China has spent the last 10 years quietly turning the region into a critical node in its Belt and Road Initiative. Since 2005, China's trade with Latin America has grown from $40 billion to over $450 billion. Venezuela alone owes Beijing at least $60 billion, much of it backed by oil shipments that bypass Western sanctions. Russia, for its part, has turned Caracas into a forward operating base for its Wagner Group mercenaries and a testing ground for hybrid warfare tactics. When Maduro's regime held sham elections in 2018, Moscow sent election observers to legitimize the fraud. When the U.S. imposed sanctions, Russian banks stepped in to launder Venezuela's money. This isn't an alliance of convenience, it's a strategic partnership, and it's here to stay. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. no longer has the luxury of treating Venezuela as a secondary theater. If Maduro gets away with annexing Essequibo, even symbolically, it won't just embolden him, it will send a message to every autocrat in the region that the U.S. is a paper tiger. Nicaragua's Ortega, Cuba's Diaz-Canel, even Bolivia's Arce, they're all watching. And if they conclude that Washington won't push back, they'll start testing their own red lines. Ortega has already expelled U.S. diplomats and aligned with Russia. Diaz-Canel has doubled down on repression, knowing that the U.S. has no appetite for another Cuba-style standoff. Arce, for his part, has flirted with joining BRICS, a move that would give China and Russia a foothold in the heart of South America. So what's the grand strategy here? First, the U.S. needs to stop thinking in terms of short-term fixes. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign failed because it was all sticks and no carrots. The Biden administration's approach, dangling sanctions relief in exchange for concessions, hasn't worked either, because Maduro doesn't want to negotiate, he wants to survive. The only way to break this cycle is to combine targeted economic pressure with a long-term plan to rebuild Venezuela's democratic institutions. That means working with the opposition to create a shadow government in waiting, one that can step in when Maduro's regime finally collapses. It means engaging with Venezuela's military, which is the only institution that can remove Maduro without triggering a civil war. And it means offering a clear path to reintegration for Venezuela's neighbors, particularly Brazil and Colombia, which have the most to lose if the country implodes. Second, the U.S. needs to counter China and Russia's influence in the region. That doesn't mean trying to outspend Beijing, we can't, and we shouldn't. Instead, it means offering Latin American countries a better investment without strings attached, trade without debt traps, and security partnerships that don't come with the baggage of U.S. interventionism. The Biden administration's America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity is a step in the right direction, but it's not enough. We need to think bigger. Why not a hemisphere-wide energy grid that integrates Venezuela's oil reserves with Brazil's hydroelectric power and Chile's lithium? Why not a regional infrastructure bank that competes with China's Belt and Road? These aren't pipe dreams, they're the kind of initiatives that could shift the balance of power in Latin America. Third, the U.S. needs to prepare for the day after Maduro. The last time Venezuela had a transition, when Chavez died in 2013, it was a mess. The opposition was divided, the military was fractured, and the country's institutions were in shambles. This time, we can't afford to make the same mistakes. That means working with the opposition to create a unity government, one that includes not just the traditional parties but also civil society groups, labor unions, and even dissident Chavistas. It means offering amnesty to mid-level regime officials who defect, while holding the top brass accountable for their crimes. And it means having a plan for Venezuela's economy, which is in even worse shape than it was in 2013. The country's oil production has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels a day in 1998 to less than 800,000 today. Its infrastructure is crumbling, its currency is worthless, and its people are starving. Rebuilding Venezuela will take decades, and it will require a level of commitment that the U.S. hasn't shown since the Marshall Plan. Now, I know what some of you are: this all sounds great, but what about the political realities? The U.S. is deeply polarized, Congress is gridlocked, and the American public has no appetite for another foreign entanglement. I get it. But here's the: we don't have a choice. Venezuela isn't going to fix itself. If we don't act, someone else will: China, Russia, or Iran, and they won't have our interests at heart. The question isn't whether we can afford to get involved, it's whether we can afford not to. Let me leave you with this. In 1999, when Hugo Chavez first took power, few people outside Venezuela paid much attention. He was just another Latin American populist, a flash in the By the time the US realized what he was doing, packing the courts, stacking the military, rigging the elections, it was too late. Chavez had already transformed Venezuela into a one-party state, and he was using its oil wealth to export his revolution across the region. Maduro is Chavez's heir, but he's also something a leader with nothing left to lose. He's not trying to build a legacy, he's trying to survive. And that makes him far more dangerous. The Essequibo dispute is a warning. It's Venezuela's way of telling the world that it's not afraid to burn down the house to stay in power. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to treat this as just another crisis to be managed, or are we going to recognize it for what a turning point in the battle for Latin America's future? The clock is ticking. And the longer we wait, the harder it will be to turn back the tide.